Thank you, Tim, for including me in this group of esteemed lawyers. I'm sort of the court jester, I think. Thank you for having me. As Tim referenced, I am very new to this issue and to being a gun owner. I shot a gun for the very first time in November 2011. And I just got a gun a year ago, February. So it's very new to me. And as Tim said, I'd been a victim of a crime in D.C. I was, make a long story short, I was dog sitting for some friends who had this really big house in Northwest, and I took the dog for a walk and quite stupidly left the front door unlocked, closed but unlocked. I was only gone for a few minutes, and it was New Year's Day, and by the time I got back, there was a man coming out of the house as I was coming in. And at first I wasn't even scared. I just said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm here to clean the pool." And it was January 1st. So I said, "Well, we didn't call someone to clean the pool." And he said, "Oh, it's the neighbors." And he kind of scooted out and ran down the street. Well, I thought, well, I better get a picture of him so I can tell the police, just in case something's up. And so I grabbed my BlackBerry, armed with a BlackBerry. I chased him down the street. And that was really stupid, and the police have given me a lot of lectures on not watching Law & Order and trying to pretend that I am Law & Order since then. But I got into this cul-de-sac and saw 12, 15 men standing there looking at me, suddenly surprised, in 2 pickup trucks. I found out later they had just been robbing all the houses in the neighborhood, and I'd come back and surprised them. And the police came over. He had been in the house. He'd stolen my wallet. He'd gotten far into the kitchen. When the police came and looked, the thing they were most concerned about was that the bad guys hadn't left some of the doors and windows open so they could come back that night and get the good stuff since I surprised them. And so as I was sleeping that night in this house, and obviously I was walking a dog that was completely useless for self-defense. He didn't even bark. I thought, I was terrified. I was simply terrified. And, we've heard, and, we were hearing earlier about these women who've been raped and murdered in D.C. D.C. is one of the few places in the country where violent crime is increasing every year. And I'll point out, as a woman, rapes, sexual assaults, which include rapes, were up 50% in D.C. last year, in 2012. Something the police chief, Lanier, does not like to be discussed. But it is a dangerous city. And as I was falling asleep that night, or I couldn't fall asleep, what I did to protect myself is I took a dresser and barricaded against the door, so in case the bad guys come, I could maybe defend myself. But it suddenly occurred to me, what I would love to do is have a gun by my bedside. And in my entire life, it never once occurred to me before that thought. But at this time, I was so scared, and I wanted to protect myself. So that's when the next day, I went on Twitter, which I'm a big fan of, @EmilyMiller, and I get all my information that way, and I sort of said, I want to get a gun in D.C., what does it take? And this was 2010 when this happened, and I got just reams of responses. It's impossible, you can't get one, you can't get it. And, as a citizen, a journalist, I've been aware that, Heller had been decided, that these guys had fought to get me my Second Amendment rights restored. So I knew it was legal, so I couldn't understand why everybody was saying you can't get it. I soon found out. So I went to get a gun, and as we said, I went to my editor and said, I'm going to get a gun anyway. How about I write about it in the Washington Times? He said, that's fine. I said, I think it'll take probably a couple weeks. It ended up taking me 4 months to get a gun, to get a legal gun. And I'll add, as we were speaking earlier about the right to bear arms, and which we hope to get the city to be recognized at some point as well. I spent 4 months getting a gun. It cost $435 in fees, and I can't take it out of the home. So that's what it costs just to keep arms in Washington. What I did was, and I could take up 4 months telling you the story of what it took to get a gun in D.C. And what I found out and what the response was on Twitter was, after these gentlemen fought the Supreme Court to get me my right to keep arms in D.C., the city council passed these absolutely outrageous registration rules on what you had to do to get one, to make it virtually impossible. They didn't want us to have guns, and they still don't want us to have guns, and they will tell you they don't want you to have guns. So I, not knowing any of this really, I started by just going to the police station. I'd never been there before. There's a firearm registration office, and I walked in and I said, I'm here to buy a gun. And the police officer looked at me and she goes, well, do you have a gun? And I said, no, I don't have a gun. I need to get a permit to get a gun. I didn't know the language then, so I didn't realize that permit generally means carry. And she goes, well, you can't carry a gun like this, like me, you can't do that. And I said, well, how do and I said, I thought it was like a driver's license, like you go in and you get a license and then you can get a gun. She said, oh, no, you go get a gun and then you come back and we'll let you know if you pass it, then possibly we'll let you register it. I said, okay, so where do you buy guns? I mean, I've never been through this before. I had no idea. And she said, well, not in D.C. So, but she handed me, I mean, I counted later, 22 pieces of paper. And she said, just follow this little guide and come back. So I took it home and I was like, how in the world am I going to figure this out? So I sorted through it and I spent a day or two going through it. And I finally just said, I'm just going to write down all the steps so I can go through them and check them off. And I found out there were 17 steps in order to register a legal gun. And actually, after I went through it, I found out there were 24 steps. So it was 17 that I was facing. And I will just briefly run through what it took to get a gun. You have to fill out an eligibility form, and then you have to get it notarized. And I personally never had anything notarized before, so I didn't even know where to do that. You have to find a DC certified instructor to take this 5-hour safety class. Then you take the 5-hour safety class and get the instructor to fill out the form. You have to provide proof that you have perfect vision, but I found out my driver's license sufficed, so that was good. Proof of residency, that was easy. 2 passport photos. It's not like the DMV, they don't do it for you. You have to study for a test, and that's a whole separate time frame. Then you take a 20 multiple choice test, written test in the police station. I later found out you can only take that after you bought the gun and have a serial number. I went to the station to take my test, had studied, had very ready to take it, and they wouldn't let me take it, had to leave. You have to get fingerprinted. That the police will do for you, and they make you pay for it. You have to pay fees, $60 worth of fees to the city for that. But you have to pay the DMV. So if you've ever been to the DMV in DC and you see those lines, some of those people, very few, but some of them are like me, they're to pay for your gun fees. So those lines just as long. You have to buy the gun. And as I found out from the police, you can't buy one in DC. And then, which I didn't find out then, I found out later, that the gun you buy can't have a high-capacity magazine, which I found after I bought my SIG, Sauer 229, that it comes with a magazine that is 13 rounds magazine. That's the standard. So you can't just buy it and have it shipped to our dealer. You have to find someone who will exchange that magazine for one that's not high capacity, meaning that they stick a little metal thing into the magazine so it can't take 3 more rounds. That took weeks in and of itself. And then we have one gun dealer in DC, Charles Sykes, who I've gotten to know very, very well through this process and spent quite a bit of time in his office. He transfers the gun. He does not buy or sell guns. He only transfers. His fee is $125. And you can gasp, and I know we've all discussed that that's the highest fee in the country. Having spent quite a bit of time with Charles Sykes, I am a defender of his fees because so few people go through what I did to get guns. He only works a few hours a day, and I think at this point it's about 1,200 guns are registered a year. Many of those are already pre-owned, so they don't need Sykes at all. Many of them are multi-guns for some people. He's barely, I averaged it out, making about $30,000 a year off this. So he's not getting rich. He really does it because he believes in our ability to get to have a Second Amendment. So anyway, Charles Sykes, transfer fee, $125, cash only. But there is an ATM machine near the DMV. I found that out in the process. Then you take your firearms, your documents to Sykes once the gun has been delivered to him, and he will only accept it with a 10-round magazine. You take him your documents, he fills them out, he calls the FBI, does your NICS check while you're there. Then you take your forms back up to the police station, and then a police officer comes, escorts you down to Sykes' office, takes your gun away from you, takes it for a ballistics test. And I, having never even touched my own gun at this point, I wanted to go because I had no idea where they're taking it, wouldn't let me come to the ballistics test. So they're going to go shoot my gun. They did shoot my gun. And then they bring it back, and then they escort you and your gun back to the police station, and then they approve your gun. And I kept asking along the way, what if I do my 17 steps and they don't approve my gun. Then I'm out all this money, and the police officers were like, that's the system, that's the system, that's the process. And I have to say, I heard the word "the process" about 50 times out of those police officers' mouths. I mean, it was the most frustrating place. Anyway, then you go and you fill out your paperwork, you give it to them, and they say, okay, now you have a 5-day waiting period. So then after the 5-day waiting period, then they go, okay, now you have 5 more day waiting period before Charles Sykes can give you a gun. So there's these 2 waiting periods. And then you go get your gun from Charles Sykes, you take it to the police station, they look at it, they approve it, they make sure it's in a lockbox, they won't let you take it without a lockbox, which is federal transport laws. And then I took my gun home on the Metro, because that was the way I got there. And it drove the police, it was a little bit to drive the police crazy. I did it that way. But I'll tell you, in that whole process, the part that was the most onerous and was the part where I was thinking, I give up. Like, I don't care anymore. I don't want a gun. I actually went to my editor. I said, I give up. I'm not writing the story anymore. I don't want to do it. It was the 5-hour safety class process. And the way the city made that so impossible is they put together this list. 2 pages is the thing I got the first day. They hand it to you when you walk in. All it is names and phone numbers. No websites, no emails, no addresses, no affiliation, no idea who these people are. And then the city doesn't regulate it, so you don't know what they cost. You don't know anything. So I started calling. I kept getting all these wrong numbers or disconnected or people being like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then finally, I just thought, something's wrong here. So I spent one day just calling every name. There are 47 names on this list. It had not been updated since 2009 when this law had started. And out of the 47 people, I found 4 who were ready and willing, able to give this class. And the cheapest I could find was $200. The rest were $250. One guy, this was the kicker, this is the one that put me over the deep end. One guy was like, I do teach it only in Colorado. And I was like, why would you teach the DC registry safety class in Colorado? He goes, there's quite a demand. I was like, there are 400 people a year doing this. Who is in, I mean, I'm sure that there's, how about legalizing drugs? That guy's, I don't know what he's really doing on that list. Anyway, so there's so many things that are unconstitutional about this class. First of all, it's illegal to teach in DC because you can't shoot, and one of the requirements was an hour at the range. So all of this is in Maryland, DC. Obviously, it's cost prohibitive for most of the city. $250 is a ridiculous cost. It's mandatory. And then as a woman, I went to my editor and I was like, all right, of these 4 guys, all of them teach in their house. I don't know where they live. I don't know who they are. One guy actually said, oh yeah, lady, I just teach it in my basement. And I was like, I've seen Silence of the Lambs. I'm not going in some strange man's basement who's armed, who he knows I'm not armed. And I mean, I was like, so I said to my editor, I was like, forget it. I'm not doing this. I'm not putting myself at risk. In the end, what I did is I found there was a woman who taught the class, Donna Worthy, near Baltimore in Maryland. She had been trying to get on this list for 3 years. The police would not update the list, and she was a former police officer, and she has a storefront. So that's where I took my class. It was a real place with a classroom. It did cost $250. And so that was the owners, and as many of you know, the city council through this process has changed some of it. They've eliminated this class. They've eliminated the ballistics test. They've taken some of the things out. So I now count 11 steps. They're being very generous to us. But I'm a gun owner now and such a strong believer in the Second Amendment and did not understand at all what it was like to not have my Bill of Rights being recognized. So I will continue to write in the Washington Times about what's going on both in DC and around the country with these gun control laws that have swept the nation this year. And it's because, quite frankly, 2 things need to happen. One is everyone in this country has the right to keep arms. There should not be a registration process. That is, no registered gun in DC has ever been used in a crime. This is not how criminals are getting guns. It is only stopping the law-abiding from defending themselves. And we all need the right to bear arms. It's still shocking to me, and I can't wait till Alan gets a case to get to Supreme Court, that I don't have the right to bear arms in my home. So thank you all so much, and the rest will go to questions.